Welcome everyone to another one of our Anglicanism 101s. This is session 4. I know there's a few folk who join us from America. My wife's American. So if you're joining us from the States, I hope you had a lovely Thanksgiving yesterday. Certainly we had our fill yesterday of turkey and pecan pie. So I hope you had a lovely Thanksgiving. For everyone else, our usual folk in Kilternan and other folk in these shores, I hope you've had a lovely week. So this is number 4 of our Anglicanism 101. What I want to look at today is prayer and worship. Anglican approaches to prayer and Anglican approaches to worship. Now we could take a session on each of those and we'll see how we do with this one. We might pick up and go a little bit deeper in one of those areas maybe in a few weeks. We'll see how it unfolds. But I think different traditions communicate their theology, or different traditions communicate their core beliefs in different ways. Presbyterians, I think, and like I mentioned last time I grew up, Presbyterians preach their theology. So there's a big emphasis on the preacher, and Presbyterian sermons can be infamously longer than Anglican services. If I tried to do a 35-40 minute sermon in Kilternan, I think I'd be chased out of the church. But Presbyterians have a culture of preaching their theology. Methodists, I'm stereotyping here of course, but Methodists sing their theology. So that they're built very much in the tradition of Charles Wesley, and Wesley of course was a great hymn writer, which is why you get those big Methodist hymns with 9, 10 plus verses in them, and often very dense and full of wonderful theology. And Methodists often sing them with great verve because their theology is often sung. Catholics, it said, what Catholics often do is they perform their theology, which is why there's such an emphasis on the visual, on the bells and the smells and the colours and the sort of performativity or performance of church, because it's in the performance of the liturgies that their theology is performed. It's often said that what we Anglicans do is that we pray our theology. Now, we have a strong culture of private or personal prayer, and I'm not so much going to focus on that today. What I want to think about is this idea of prayer as a corporate experience, because that is at the heart of how we understand worship. And you see that in our services. Anglicans will talk about morning prayer and evening prayer, because prayer is the central experience of how we gather for worship. If you look at any of our services, or the structures of our services, there will be introductory prayers, prayers of intercession or prayers of the people. There will be pre-communion prayers and post-communion prayers. There will be the collect of the day, which is the special prayer that is set aside for the day. Even our book. Now, the primary book for Anglicans is always the Bible, but our book that forms the basis of our experience of worship, actually we call the Book of Common Prayer. And it understands that prayer is not just an individual thing, but prayer is that which brings us together. Prayers is the forum of the commons. So today what I want to do is I want to look a little bit at, I guess, where this book came from and how we may understand it. But I also want to look at how the Anglican understanding of prayer and worship is evolving and growing very much in the spirit of what Cranmore intended. I'm on the coffee today. I'm on a to-go cup. It's actually pretty early, so I've got my coffee from the gathering grounds in my compostable cup. If it helps you to get a cup, go on ahead and let's get stuck in. One of the great truths of all worship is that our worship is always shaped by our history, and our worship carries its history with it, and that's important. We Anglicans are churches of scripture, reason and tradition, and it's often in our worship where we carry with us our tradition. It's perhaps in our worship that we are most commonly seen as belonging to the Catholic churches. We are Catholic and Reformed, and it's in our worship that we often see our Catholic identity most strong. In the Church of Ireland, we, particularly perhaps in Kilternan, but I imagine lots of other Church of Ireland churches are the same. We have a lot of people who've moved to us in recent years from the Catholic tradition for various reasons, and when they arrive having known so little about Anglicanism, they say, goodness, there's so much in the actual service of worship that's familiar to us. And that's true. There is more that is familiar than there is not. We have the same seasons, we have the same colours, we have the same sort of liturgical shape. However, the Book of Common Prayer, which was written by Thomas Cranmer, or originally written by Thomas Cranmer, you'll hear me refer to the BCP, and that's just shorthand for Book of Common Prayer. The BCP reflected new theological thought and a new theological direction that perhaps we do take somewhat for granted today. What Cranmer wanted to do, what he longed to do, is he longed to give the people a liturgy, a form of worship, a form of prayer, through which the people could articulate a new and a direct approach to God. So there are lots of services in this book, but it's shaped around two great liturgies. One is the liturgy of the Eucharist, or the Holy Communion, or the Lord's Supper. And that's the great thanksgiving of the church, where we gather around the Lord's table. The other are the divine offices, which come from the monastic tradition, the monasteries, and Cranmer's, one of his masterstrokes was to bring it into the life of the people. Both the Eucharist and the divine offices in the BCP, the aspiration was to make them accessible to the people and to make them more immediate in their appeal. And the BCP was in many ways a liturgical revolution. And there were riots in the streets, which is inconceivable that folk would riot on the streets today about a liturgy within the church. But this was revolutionary. Cranmer set himself the task of re-expressing the great liturgies of the church in such a way and in such a language that people could actually understand it, but actually use it. It was a great act of modernization, a great act of translation and reinterpretation, and in many ways a new appropriation of liturgy for the people. People will know that I've been using this book, How to Be an Anglican, by Richard Giles. He has a lovely piece in here where he says there's a certain irony when we reflect on the radical nature of the BCP, on what Cranmer was trying to do in terms of revolutionizing this text. He shares a certain irony, and I'm going to read it out to you. He said, "It is ironic in the extreme that those on both sides of the Atlantic," and Giles was in England and in the US, "on both sides of the Atlantic, who today would attempt to justify the continued use of 17th century rites, should associate the name of Cranmer with the perpetuation of antiquated language and worship. Not merely spinning in his grave, Cranmer must be going into orbit." Cranmer recognized a few things. Cranmer recognized the sterility of worship in the church at the time. He recognized that more often than not, masses were simply muttered behind screens or communion rails. He recognized that congregations were disengaged. He recognized that the great liturgies were not presented in a mode or a language that people understood or related to. And he understood that worship and prayer had become nothing more than meaningless and vain repetition. Now, those who follow very much in the spirit of Cranmer, and I'd like to put myself within that, we'll observe in Cranmer's initial observation, there is a challenge for the church, because we have to regularly confess this sterility of much of our worship today. How easy it is for every church to drift into the same place that the church was in before the original BCP revolution, when in too many of our churches the people have become disconnected from worship, where worship has become a performance behind screens or communion rails, where often our prayers, no matter how beautiful they may be, have drifted into vain repetition. So there has to be within worship and within prayer a constant sense of re-examination and renewal, because that is part of the Anglican approach to worship. Within the BCP, Cranmer sought to do a number of things. One, in the act of Holy Communion or in the Eucharist, he sought to increase participation. And we saw in the early days of Cranmer an attempt to even pull the communion table into the centre of the gathering, so that the people of God could gather around the table. And there was also a renewed emphasis on the daily office, on morning and evening prayer. And they were quite revolutionary for a number of reasons. And first, that the language was presented very much in a language that actually meant something to people. But also, the really important thing about morning and evening prayer is they don't actually need a priest. The people can do morning and evening prayer. And that was a wonderful rupture as well, because that was a huge challenge to clericalism, which continues to plague the church today. We should recognize, however, that the book that we have today, in the various forms that we'll talk about in a little bit later, did go through a number of edits. The first book that Cranmer put together was in 1549, and it went through a whole series of edits for the next 120 years, eventually settling into a book that probably most of us who are Anglicans are familiar with, in 1662. And in those 110, 120 years, there was a huge pendulum of changes, slightly more Reformed Protestant, then a little bit more Catholic, and then a bit more Reformed, and eventually finding some kind of equilibrium in 1662. And then, interestingly, the book was static for largely 300 years. Now listen, there were many efforts through time to try to change it, but for various reasons, some political and some social, the prayer book remained largely static for 300 years. Of course, in recent years, there's been a huge renewal and re-examination of how we do prayer and how we do worship as a church. Let's think about that. In recent years, and by recent years I mean maybe the last 30 or 40 years, there's been an emphasis worldwide in re-examining the BCP, and to, in many ways, updating and refreshing our liturgies and our prayer and our worship and how we express ourselves before God. And that's taken a number of shapes and forms. In Ireland, it was in 1997. We were a little bit late in the day when the Liturgical Advisory Committee was commissioned with the task of preparing a new edition of the Book of Common Prayer. And the Book of Common Prayer that we have in our churches today, or that we use for our services, is reflective of the 2004 edition. But this was happening across the globe. Anglican churches were re-examining their liturgies, and they tended to change in three ways. The first way in which they changed was quite simply in regards to the language that they used. So the original BCP was written in Victorian English, and that was because that was the language that was used. Previously it was in the Vulgate, so it was spoken in Latin, which was the language of the priestly class. It wasn't the language that people used, So Cranmere changed it to the language that people related to. Today, of course, no one says sundry places, and Concord is a plane, not a reference to peace. So it is right, and I think no one really debates that in the spirit of Cranmere, it's appropriate that we update the language and we present our services of worship in a language that people can actually understand. Of course, there's a pushback on that because language operates at lots of different levels. There is the language that people use, but then there's always the language that there's also the language of memory, and there's the language of aesthetics. So there are some people that say, well, I understand why we're updating the language, but I really like the old prayer of thanksgiving, or I like that because it has a memory trigger for me. I remember saying those words when I was young, so those words bring me comfort and consolation. There's also an aesthetic language. Now, I sometimes think this is overrated. There are some of the old Victorian language in the prayer book is spectacular, but some of it's clunky. And I think those people who sit on the aesthetic spectrum tend to point out the bits that are nice and forget the bits that are clunky. But there's something which says, that old Victorian language is beautiful, so it's important that we maintain the beauty. So that's the same cohort that perhaps really push for the reading of the King James scriptures. And it's fine, and if that's what people like to use for their prayers and devotion, I'm supportive of it. But in regards to that which we do collectively in the spirit of Cranmere, and Cranmere wasn't overly interested in aesthetics, and Cranmere was interested in presenting worship in a way in which people could relate to. So there's an understanding that it is right that we update the language of the prayer book. But there are two other ways in which we have seen our worship update in recent years. One is changes in regards to meaning. And here's what I mean by that. The prayer book that Cranmere wrote, as amazing as it was, reflected the cultural questions that were going on at that time. They reflected the relationship between the churches, which were generally fairly hostile. They reflected a certain Victorian cultural milieu. They reflected a certain anthropology. Now, of course, that's changed. I think of the world in which my great-grandparents lived in, and the questions that they faced are so different from the questions that we face today. So it's no surprise that when we start going back to a book that was written in 1549 or 1664, of course, meaning has changed. Our self-understanding has changed. But we can't also underestimate the fact that we are now in a place as a church where we are confident enough to engage in genuine conversation with other church traditions. And that wasn't always the case, certainly not in Cranmere's time. So we are now in healthy dialogue with the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the Coptic Church, the Methodist Church, the emerging churches. We are in healthy conversation. So we are now in a place where we are open to learn. What insights does your tradition present that may help my tradition be better? And we are saying that in our renewal of our liturgies. We now have the courage to add new things and take new things on board. But we should also recognize within the pages of our prayer book that there are things that may communicate unhealthy meaning today. I'm very mindful, for example, this week we have been thinking about the 16-day campaign of activism and prayer to end gender-based violence. And it's an important campaign to get behind, and we want to be supportive of that and raise awareness. But I'm very mindful that whenever I stand in front of a church and read, for example, our old liturgies, to think about a woman who is at home, who has experienced an abuse and has been told every day that she is worthless, and is being told every day that she will never amount to anything and she is no good. And then for me to open up a meeting with reference to her manifold sins and wickedness, and then to have a general confession that refers to her as a miserable offender. I think we now have an understanding based on a current anthropology that says that this does not have the pastoral value that it once did. So those people who have taken it upon themselves to examine how we do corporate worship and corporate prayer rightly need to get to grips with how we can take the ideas and aspirations of Cranmere but present them in such a way that relates effectively to the needs of people and that brings people before God. The last way, so first way is in regards to simply the updating of language. The second one is to reflect new theological and anthropological understanding. But the third thing that we're seeing, and we don't actually have a lot of it in Ireland, but lots of Anglican churches across the world have decided that what they want to do is look at gender neutral language in their liturgies. During our Tea and Theology series, we explored bits and pieces of this, how God is beyond category. So God is not always a he or a she. So a lot of the prayer books, I think one of the most obvious examples is the prayer book in New Zealand. They have tried to go through their prayer book to look at how masculine language is often presented and to explore ways in which language can be gender neutral. For some people, they are bigger issues than others. But the truth is, in our liturgy and our prayer book, we are seeing an evolution and a change. And let me step back, because I think there is something at the minute that has happened culturally that we need to be very mindful of. On the first session of Anglican 101, where we looked at the history of where Anglicanism came from, we talked about how it emerged out of three things. One, changes politically. Two, changes philosophically. And three, changes in technology. So politically, there was huge upheaval. Henry VIII and other historical conflicts and wars. We talked about how there was a new philosophy or theology emerging, coming from Germany and Switzerland, but prevalent throughout all of Europe. And then we talked also about the printing press and how the printing press changed how information could disseminate, and it changed how ordinary people could have access to ideas. And the convergence of those three things is what provided the soil for the seismic shift that we refer to as the Reformation, from which we have the Anglican tradition. Arguably today, in the church, we find ourselves at a place where we have a similar convergence of things happening. Firstly, we have entered into a whole new political arena in the last number of decades. We have words for that. Some people will refer to it as the New World Order. Some people will refer to it as the rise of globalization. However we refer to it, politics has changed in the last number of years. And we're seeing ripples of that in regards to distress and economics and other such things. But the world of politics has changed, and it's not what it was. We are seeing huge changes in philosophy. The Reformation emerged out of what we might call the Enlightenment, or what we refer to as modernity. We live in an age today that is arguably referred to as postmodern. There's a whole philosophical shift at the minute. But thirdly, there has been a significant technological jump in the last number of years. The rise of the internet and the rise of online communication is every bit as seismic as the invention of the printing press. I can sit here today on a computer in Ireland that can reach to Asia or the US or China or Africa in a matter of seconds. And someone in a village in Vietnam can write a liturgy or can make a theological reflection that can be sent all across the world in seconds. And it's amazing. But for the church, for prayer, for worship, for how we do theology, it's seismic. And we're seeing that reflected in our prayer and in our worship. And there's huge blessing in it. There's a challenge in it, but there's a huge blessing. Richard Giles in his book uses an analogy of food to help express this. And like all analogies, it's a little bit simplistic. But I wanted to share it because I think it's quite good. He says this: think back to the generations, maybe the generations of our great-grandparents, and think about what they ate. Well, of course, there were lots of things they eat, but in general, their diet, he said, would have been based on a diet of potatoes or bread. Of course, there were vegetables, there was meat, but it was always a potato or a bread-based diet. Through time, maybe because of immigration, all of a sudden, because of, he's over in England, he says, because of the ex-colony, suddenly people were tasting food from India. People were not just having bread and potatoes, but all of a sudden curries appeared. Suddenly the Queen wanted coronation chicken. And then there was a little bit of movement into France, and all of a sudden you went into a restaurant and you didn't just have meat and potatoes, you didn't just have fish and chips, but you may have had the odd sneaky lasagna or chili con carne appear. And then he says, look at where we are today. If you go into the average shopping mall and you go to the food court, you'll still get your fish and chips, and you'll still get your burgers from McDonald's, but you'll have food from Mexico and food from Japan, and you'll have Italian food. You'll have food from all over the world. And if you went into a restaurant today and you picked up a menu, and the menu only had on it the diets that our great-grandparents had, we would think that this restaurant had got stuck or lost in time. He says that we need to recognize that something similar is happening in regards to how we do worship. It's not enough anymore, he says, for us to have the potato and bread diet in our churches that we used to have a couple of 100 years ago. The truth is, there has been this convergence of politics, philosophy, and technology that has resulted in a huge change. And in the spirit of Cranmere, yes, we need to be theologically cautious. We need to have liturgical advisory committees that support and help. But we need to realize that worship is evolving. It's an exciting time for the church. We are hearing voices globally that we never heard before. We are seeing liturgies reflective of questions being asked in women's studies, in international studies. We are seeing across all our traditions a wonderful renewal in worship. The Church of England in recent years has had what they call the common worship resource. And rather than just producing another book full of another prayer, what they've done is they've provided people with a huge menu of options to use in worship. And part of it actually includes an element of risk-taking. But I think we do so in the spirit of Cranmere. whose desire when he first put together this book was to make common prayer accessible for all. That's the challenge of people like myself who lead worship, but it's the challenge for all of us as we seek to express an Anglican approach to prayer and worship. Listen, God bless. I'll see you all next time.